For decades, France maintained a grip on Africa that was more subtle than the colonizers of the past, but no less strategic. It wasn't enforced with flags and muskets, it was preserved through currency, diplomacy, debt, and dependency. They called it Francafrique, a web of shadow diplomacy, economic entanglement, military presence, and strategic resource extraction, all cloaked under the language of partnership. But something has changed, and it's collapsing fast. In the past 3 years, one after another, former French colonies, Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, and now Chad, have expelled French troops, rejected diplomatic ties, and publicly humiliated Paris on the world stage. French flags were burned in the streets, Russian and Chinese ones were raised. In capitals once loyal to the Élysée, French is no longer the language of power. So what happened? What did Macron promise Africa behind closed doors, and why did it fail? Let's pull back the curtain. In a series of discreet meetings with West African heads of state, Emmanuel Macron arrived not with demands but with promises, rhetorical, polished, and hollow. He didn't speak of revolution, he spoke of reform, of resetting the relationship between France and Africa, of ending paternalism as he called it and inaugurating a new era of mutual respect. But the symbol Macron chose to wave as proof of this transformation was the one instrument that embodied France's deep-rooted control: the CFA franc. Created during colonial rule and maintained long after independence, the CFA franc wasn't just a currency, it was a lever of submission. Under its structure, 14 African countries were forced to deposit half of their foreign reserves into France's central bank. In return, France guaranteed the currency's convertibility, but retained final control over monetary policy, appointments in African central banks, and even key approvals for financial decisions affecting sovereign nations. Macron's grand gesture was to end the CFA franc and replace it with something new, the ECO. But this was not a rupture, it was a rebrand. The ECO would still be pegged to the euro, tying these nations to European monetary policy they had no say in. The requirement to hold reserves in France was technically lifted, but oversight mechanisms ensured French influence remained embedded. French representation on monetary boards wasn't removed, it was reworded: sovereignty on paper, subordination in practice. This wasn't liberation, it was a facelift on a colonial relic. And many African leaders, especially the new generation, saw through it. Across Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, younger nationalist and pan-Africanist voices were rising, not polished technocrats trained in Paris, but men shaped by years of military service, national struggle, and popular resentment. They were not interested in poetic metaphors about reform, they wanted economic sovereignty. They wanted real control over their budgets, interest rates, and reserve flows, not filtered through Parisian desks. And when they looked past Macron's modernist speeches and youthful charm, they didn't see a new partner. They saw a custodian of empire dressed in progressive rhetoric. The disillusionment ran deep. After centuries of colonization, decades of Francafrique, and years of broken promises, Macron's offer was simply more of the same, only more eloquent. Reform that looked like continuity, change that preserved control. The break didn't come through negotiation, it came through rejection. Mali expelled French troops. Burkina Faso did the same, Niger followed suit. Anti-French protests erupted across the Sahel, fueled by a public that no longer believed in Parisian saviors. These were not fringe movements, they were mass awakenings. Because the real lesson of Macron's reform was this: you cannot repaint a system of control and expect people not to notice it still enslaves. And now, France faces a truth it long denied. Its empire didn't dissolve, it just went underground. But the people it governed never forgot. And now, they're choosing sovereignty over symbolism, and action over appeasement. France's dominance in Africa was never about soldiers alone, it was about silence, structures, and systems. Francafrique, they called it. But this was no alliance, it was an empire in disguise. After official independence, France didn't leave. It embedded itself deeper, through money, through corporations, through diplomacy, and through quiet threats. At the center of it all was the CFA franc, a currency used in 14 African countries, created in 1945 by France, and still backed by the French treasury. Until recently, these nations were required to deposit 50% of their foreign reserves in the Banque de France. That's not partnership, that's custody. France claimed it guaranteed stability, but in reality it guaranteed control. Even with recent reforms, the structural grip remained. The new currency, the ECO, was little more than a rebrand. it remained pegged to the euro, its convertibility still under French influence, and its central bank still designed with Parisian fingerprints. France didn't send its soldiers alone, it sent its system. Through powerful corporations like Total, Areva, now Orano, Bolloré and Orange, France turned resource-rich regions into engines of extraction and communities into suffering landscapes. In Niger, French firms have mined uranium for over 40 years. Today, half of France's nuclear-powered lights run off uranium dug from Nigerian soil. Yet a staggering 98% of rural villages there still lack electricity, even while radiation from mining dust envelops them. Around Arlit and Akokan, local herders report sick livestock, poisoned water, and illnesses among people exposed to radioactive tailings, as scientists find background radiation levels up to 500 times higher than normal. The true human cost is even crueler. Children continue to labor in artisanal mines across West and Central Africa, wielding picks, hauling heavy loads, panning gold in open shafts. In Mali alone, between 20,000 and 40,000 children work informal mines, breathing mercury-laced dust and risking injury or sexual exploitation. Their hands shake from neurological damage, their bones weaken, their childhoods are stolen while commodity markets smile complacently. Bolloré, the logistics behemoth, has used these conditions to secure lucrative port concessions across Togo, Ghana, Cameroon, and Côte d'Ivoire. Total and Orange are no better. Oil pipelines snake through fields without ever delivering light to homes. And to enforce it all, security. France positioned itself as Africa's bodyguard. Operation Serval in 2013, Operation Barkhane 2014 to 2022. French troops deployed to Mali, Chad, Burkina Faso, Niger, supposedly to fight jihadism. But the locals began to see a pattern. French drones killed civilians. Soldiers patrolled cities. France supported leaders who stayed loyal, and quietly removed those who didn't. Documents and testimonies continued to link French intelligence to the 1987 assassination of Thomas Sankara, Burkina Faso's revolutionary anti-imperialist president. He nationalized land, cut ties with the IMF, and dared to reject dependency. A few months after meeting with France's emissaries, he was dead, killed in a coup backed by Blaise Compaoré, and this wasn't isolated. In Chad, Gabon, and the Ivory Coast, France propped up regimes that served its interests. For decades, the unspoken contract held, France would provide stability, development, and defense, but that contract is now in flames. Between 2020 and 2023, a seismic shift shook the Sahel, not through elections, treaties, or quiet reforms, but through the clang of boots and the crackle of coups. One by one, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger fell into the hands of military regimes. But these were not merely power grabs. They were revolts, revolutions, against a deeper, older tyranny, dependency. In Mali, the junta did not mince words. French troops, they claimed, were not just ineffective. They were part of the problem. There were public accusations, often echoed in street protests, that France had not only failed to defeat jihadist insurgents, but had armed or enabled them behind the scenes to justify its long-term military presence. For many Malians, this wasn't conspiracy, it was continuity. A continuation of the colonial strategy, create chaos, then offer control as the solution. In Niger, President Mohamed Bazoum, a close ally of Paris and Washington, was ousted. His government had embraced expanded military cooperation with the West. France and the US both maintained troops and drone bases there, citing the threat of terrorism. But on the ground, resentment grew. Locals saw foreign soldiers as occupiers, not protectors. The coup was not just a military reshuffle, it was a public rebuke of external dependency disguised as security. Burkina Faso followed suit. The new leadership didn't simply take over, they issued a declaration, the beginning of a Pan-African realignment. French troops were ordered out, regional alliances were reshaped, flags changed, and more importantly, so did the narratives. No longer was stability the highest goal, sovereignty was. From Paris, the reaction was predictable. First, denial, then panic. France froze development aid, recalled ambassadors, issued condemnations, but the more it protested, the more it exposed its own stake in the power structure it claimed to have outgrown. And in the streets of Bamako, Niamey, and Ouagadougou, the message was shouted, spray-painted, and sung, France must go, for good. And as France pulled back, a vacuum formed. But it didn't last long. Russia stepped in, not just with military advisors but with weapons and propaganda, offering support without lectures. China entered with long-term infrastructure deals, mining contracts, and economic pledges. Turkey brought trade, political neutrality, and cultural diplomacy. Even Iran and the UAE began quietly courting influence. What was once France's uncontested backyard is now a battleground of multipolar influence, where no one actor dominates but all compete. To call these coups mere military takeovers is to miss the larger transformation. They were manifestos in action, a brutal, controversial, and unmistakable break from the post-colonial script, one that said, "You are free, but only under our supervision." That script is now being torn up, and while the new actors aren't saints and their regimes are far from perfect, the psychological shift is irreversible. Africa, at least this corner of it, is no longer willing to trade sovereignty for subsidies or silence for support. France, once the colonial godfather, is now being replaced, not by a single power, but by a network of alternatives, not by democracies perhaps, but by those who understand a simple truth: dependency, no matter how well dressed, is still domination. The collapse of France's influence in West Africa isn't just a diplomatic humiliation, it's an economic reckoning. Beneath the layers of military operations and cultural exchange programs lies a hard truth that few in Paris will admit publicly. France still relied on its former colonies to project global power, and to finance it. The expulsion of French troops and the unraveling of political alliances in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger have triggered a cascade of economic consequences that go far beyond defense strategy. French companies, long embedded in African infrastructure, energy, and telecommunications, are now being pushed out, their contracts revoked or frozen. Total Energies, Bolloré, Orano, giants once insulated by soft power and state backing, now face legal uncertainty, operational hostility, and, in some cases, outright nationalization threats. Perhaps the most devastating blow is in uranium. Niger alone supplied up to 15% of the uranium France needs to power its nuclear reactors, the backbone of French energy independence. With the military regime in Niamey now pivoting toward alternative allies like Russia and China, these uranium exports are no longer guaranteed. The cost of losing even part of that supply chain would send ripples through France's energy market, potentially destabilizing its entire nuclear-dependent model. But the fallout doesn't stop at industry. Cultural institutions, the quiet arms of influence, are crumbling too. French-language schools, once viewed as elite institutions, are being shut down or burned by angry protesters. The Institut Français, France's flagship cultural network, is losing credibility and relevance. In several countries, French embassies have been attacked, their flags torn down, their staff evacuated. In a symbolic sense, France is not just being evicted from African soil, it's being erased from the African imagination. Emmanuel Macron entered office with the charisma of a disruptor but the instincts of a manager. And in Africa, where the ghosts of colonialism still walk in broad daylight, that combination proved fatal. He promised a new chapter, an end to paternalism, a partnership of equals. But the more he spoke of reform, the more obvious it became. The architecture of control remained intact. The CFA franc remained tethered to France. French troops remained on the ground. French companies remained in command of key infrastructure, ports, and minerals. Macron's rhetoric, a polished blend of technocratic optimism and post-colonial sensitivity, was designed to appease both sides. To African audiences, he spoke of decolonization and sovereignty. To French elites, he whispered continuity, but in trying to split the difference, he lost both camps. To the French right, Macron became a symbol of decline, of a once mighty France losing its grip on what was euphemistically called its pré carré, its sphere of influence. As coup after coup unfolded in the Sahel, with French flags burned in public squares and Russian ones raised in their place, Macron looked helpless. He withdrew troops under pressure, recalled ambassadors, froze aid, but these reactions only fed a narrative of weakness, that France, under Macron, was being humiliated on the world stage. To the African left, Macron was never credible to begin with. His background as a Rothschild banker and his unwavering belief in market liberalism made him a neoliberal in African eyes, a new face on an old system. His promises of reform rang hollow when French troops remained in Bamako, and Nigerian uranium still flowed north. For them, Macron was not a reformer. He was the latest manager of imperial continuity, offering smoother optics while preserving the extraction machine. Caught in the middle, Macron tried to posture as the enlightened centrist, France as guide, not master, Africa as partner, not subject. But history had already moved on. The new African generation, fueled by anti-imperial rage, digital mobilization, and global alternatives, had no patience for symbolic gestures. They wanted autonomy, not applause from Paris. And Macron's deeper miscalculation was this: he mistook the world for a system to be fine-tuned, rather than a force ready to revolt. Because in this new era, nations don't want to be managed, they want to be free. Macron, in trying to play all roles at once, reformer, ruler, mediator, ended up embodying none, and in doing so, he exposed the limits not just of French diplomacy, but of a whole Western way of thinking, that soft control is somehow different from hard power, and that language alone can pacify a rising demand for real independence. This is not just France's problem, it's the West's. What's happening in Africa is a symptom of a global psychological shift. Nations no longer accept management in exchange for dependency. Colonialism in its modern form, masked as partnerships, development aid, shared values, is being exposed for what it often still is: economic containment under moral camouflage. And when the mask slips, the rage explodes. France is discovering, too late, that you cannot trade sovereignty for security forever. At some point the cost becomes unbearable. This is not just a rejection of a foreign power, it's a reclamation of identity, of narrative, of voice. France didn't lose Africa because of one coup or one policy failure. It lost Africa because it believed it still owned the script, and Africa finally decided to rewrite the story.